Welcome to the 17th Annual Richard J. Burke Lecture in Philosophy, Religion, and Society. I am so pleased that you are with us tonight. Welcome to everyone, but also especially welcome to our alumni and community members. We are glad to have you on campus. We hope we have you back here really soon. There's a lot of great things going on at Oakland. In a moment, my colleague, Professor Michael Doan, is going to introduce tonight's speaker, but I want to first say something about this event. Richard J. Burke, for whom this series is named, he was the first faculty member ever hired at this university. And he worked as a professor here for 45 years, from 1959 to 2005, and served as chairman of the Department of Philosophy for about half that time. He shared his love of philosophy with thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of students, and put an indelible mark on the university. Upon his retirement, he made a substantial gift to endow this speaker series because he wanted his legacy of teaching to live on beyond him. Over the 17 years, we have hosted some of the world's most prominent social philosophers, including Peter Singer, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Elizabeth Anderson, Amartya Sen, and Judith Butler. We are so delighted that Dick Burke's legacy lives on tonight. Thank you so much for being here. I finally just want to thank university and college leadership for their support of our program and of this event. In particular, President Ora Peskovitz is with us tonight, Dean Elaine Carey is with us, and Provost Britt Rios-Ellis certainly sends her support. So let's get going, and at this point I invite Professor Michael Doan up to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. My name is Professor Michael Doan. I'm an associate professor here at Oakland University in the philosophy department, and it's my tremendous honor and good fortune to be introducing Linda Martín Alcoff to you all tonight. Linda Alcoff is a professor of philosophy at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Besides CUNY, she's taught at Syracuse University, and has had visiting appointments at Brown University, Cornell, Australian Catholic University, Aarhus University, and Florida Atlantic University. She's also taught for the Decolonial Institute in Spain and in South Africa. Alcoff has published over 100 articles in such areas as 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, epistemology, feminist theory, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and the philosophy of Michel Foucault. Her most recent books include Rape and Resistance, Understanding the Complexities of Sexual Violation, published by Polity Press in 2018. Also, The Future of Whiteness, published by Polity Press in 2015. And Visible Identities, Race, Gender, and the Self, published by Oxford University Press in 2006. On a personal note, I have to say that Alcoff's work in feminist epistemology and social epistemology has been especially important for me and also for many younger feminist philosophers that I know, including my wife and other people who I've studied with. One of the papers of hers that I read as a graduate student and still teach in every single epistemology course that I teach to this day, whether it's social epistemology, feminist epistemology, or just classical epistemology, is her contribution to the edited volume, Race and Epistemologies of Ignorance, in which she explores 3 different types of epistemologies of ignorance. And another really important piece of hers that influenced a lot of us as grad students was the problem of speaking for others. And tonight, she's going to be speaking to us about the persistent power of cultural racism and how we might need to move away from the idea of racism as being primarily an attitudinal or psychological matter that afflicts individuals. And instead, we might think of racism as not only being a structural, but also a cultural phenomenon And she's going to help us understand some of the ways that we can understand current events through the lens of cultural racism. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Linda Alcoff to the stage. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker for this evening.
Thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to be here to see some of my dear old friends, Phyllis Rooney and Amy Harbin, and meet some new friends like Mike and others tonight. This is part of a book project, so please give me your comments, your questions. Don't shy away from critical comments, because that'll help me. So I'm going to talk about the persistent power of cultural racism tonight, and I want to talk a little bit about what's distinct about cultural racism as opposed to other forms of racism. And to do that, of course, we have to look at this complicated and controversial concept of culture a bit, which I will do a little shortened here. How to distinguish cultural racism from cultural criticism or legitimate criticism, because I'm going to argue that I think criticism is ongoing and still important. So how do we distinguish? And then I'm going to give you a partial solution in this concept of transculturation from a Cuban anthropologist in the early 20th century. So what motivates this talk on cultural racism is I find these things wholly inadequate. So we have lots of anti-racist training today, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives by major corporations and institutions, an attempt to diversify the professional managerial class, a lot of focus and psychology on attitudinal racism and psychologies of racism. And I'm not arguing that any of these are illegitimate, but there's been a growing critique of the inadequacy and sometimes, problematic nature of DEI initiatives. Sarah Ahmed did a famous book about 10 years ago that has a lot of good critiques of it. My colleague Paisley Curra has a wonderful article called Goldman Sachs Flies the Rainbow Flag, which gives you an idea of the problem. So it's not that these are illegitimate, but I think the overall tendency of much of this work is to target non-elites, right? To target the ignorant hoi polloi, to avoid looking at the global racial empire. That's a phrase from Olufemi Taiwo's new book. To avoid questions of labor. Welcome to the labor folks who came over here tonight. And avoid questions of the flows of material resources in the DEI world. The structural approach is often limited to improving organizations in superficial ways, and there can't be any talk of dismantling organizations, right? Organizational dismantlement is not part of the DEI world in general. So it becomes like a public relations project in many cases, a public relations project to protect institutions from critique rather than really thinking deeply about what is the nature of the problem and what needs to be done. So I'm going to try to convince you that if we shift our focus a little bit to this topic of cultural racism, it has certain advantages. First and foremost, it will bring colonial history into the frame in a way that it rarely is. It helps move us away from the exclusive focus on individuals. It's not that we shouldn't focus on individuals, but the exclusive focus on individuals is obviously inadequate. I think it's going to help us target elite actors rather than non-elites in ways that I'll try to show. And I'm taking my lead in part from the work of Frantz Fanon, who said, a colonial country is a racist country. He just stated it boldly like that. So what he's partly saying here is that racism is not about conscious racist intent. There doesn't need to be conscious racist intent for there to be racist outcomes or racist structures. It's a structural organization of exploitation. So let's turn to cultural racism, which has overtaken biological racism since the end of the Nazi era. This is a passage from the sociologist Ramon Grossvogel, who says, after the Second World War, there was an important shift in the global colonial racial formation. Biological racist discourses about genetically inferior others fell into a crisis across continental Europe. The Nazi occupations delegitimized biological racist discourses in many continental Western European countries. The decline of biological racist discourses, however, did not imply the end of racism in the core of the capitalist world economy. After the defeat of the Nazi occupations in Western Europe in the 1960s civil rights struggles in Great Britain and the United States, global racial discourses shifted from biological racism to cultural racism. And I'd point out here, there's a recent article by Lawrence Bloom, who's a really great philosopher at UMass Boston, and he has a paper on cultural racism in the Journal of Social Philosophy that really does a typology of forms of cultural racism. But one of the things that he cites here is some recent research that Bobo and Charles also cite that shows that biological racism has declined in the United States to about 10% of whites who will openly and overtly avow biological racism. Of course, that doesn't mean that others don't also avow it, but it's not overtly avowed anymore, except for around 10% of whites, but there is a continuation of negative stereotyping. So there's reason to be concerned that the decline of biological forms of racism has simply provided new cover for different forms of racism, particularly cultural racism. So Fanon is writing in 1956. He's here. He gives a lecture to the Congress of Negro Artists and Writers, I think, in Paris. And he uses the term cultural racism, and this is just 11 years after the end of World War II, to talk about this shift from biological racism. And he explains that cultural racism no longer targets the individual man, but a certain form of existing, right? So cultural racism targets group behavior. It targets cultures rather than individuals. And this is where he makes the statement, a colonial country is a racist country. So he thinks that in Western societies that prize liberalism and individualism, it was, that plus the scientific invalidity of the grounds of biological racism coalesce to make it easy to counter biological racism. Because biological racism said you judge an individual, their dispositions and their aptitudes and their abilities based on their ancestry or their lineage. So it seemed to be a very anti-individualist theory. Plus, the science was showing all over the place, even by then, that genetics could not bear the weight of the claims of biological racism. So by shifting to cultural racism, it looks more rational, as I'll argue. So Fanon's analysis in this book, Toward an African Revolution, that came out in 1964, has these different elements that I want to build on. First, he says we must abandon the habit of considering racism as a mental quirk or psychological flaw, and that's often kind of the paradigm case, so we want to move away from that. He says we should reject the modernist hierarchy of cultures that makes use of the advanced, backward, or traditional historical binary categories. But this does not entail rejecting all normative comparisons. So he believed that there were cultures with racism and cultures without racism. So Fanon is judging cultures. He is not saying we can't make any judgments of cultures. He's looking at the grounds upon which we judge and compare cultures. And I'm going to develop this point. He says the so-called advanced cultures of the West overcame what he describes as the vulgar, primitive, over simple racism that claimed biological causes, but that these then simply gave way to what he describes as a more refined racism. It's a racism that is still with us in elite public culture in this country, I'll argue, and it's a racism that looks to be more academic and more rational. Colonialism, and this is to continue the long tradition of colonialism that claimed to be justified in its pursuit of the destruction of cultural values, of ways of life. Language, dress, techniques are devalorized by colonialism. But interestingly, Fanon makes this point. He believed that the destruction of cultures under conditions of colonialism had a certain goal in mind, and that goal was exploitation. Here's another passage from him. He says, in reality, the nations that undertake a colonial war have no concern for the confrontation of cultures. The enslavement in the strictest sense of the native population is the prime necessity. But for this to work, the social panorama is destructured. Values are flaunted, crushed, and emptied. The lines of force, having crumbled, no longer give direction. So what is he saying here? What he's saying here is that the attack on culture is a way to dismantle opposition against colonial forces or extractivist neo-colonial forces. It also is a way to dismantle the motive or the need to cooperate with locals rather than dominate or destroy them. You don't have to engage in dialogic epistemic encounters with those who are culturally backward. You simply need to give them education and leadership and take over their institutions and explain to them how they have to follow rules of austerity in their financial markets. So the attack on culture is not just an idea. It is embedded within a colonial and neo-colonial set of practices, and it's very functional for those practices. Yet so this is what I'm saying, the attack on cultures plays a powerful ideological role in producing hegemony even today. And everybody who espouses some ideas that I would say are culturally racist are not, they're not understanding themselves as supporting colonialism. But it plays this ideological role in excusing certain kinds of activities that the global North does to the global South. So the advantages of cultural racism, quote unquote, is that cultural racism takes aim not at individuals, but at ways of being and living, what Fanon called forms of existing. So the target is the dress, the religious practice, the community values, the modes of family formation and production of goods, artisanal production, forms of cultural expression and gender expression, and types of food eaten, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the targets. All of these become potential signs of backwardness or unbridgeable difference. And then these signs create alibis for exclusion and violence and generate debates over assimilability, which is taken to be a reasonable ground of exclusion. This is the debate going on in Europe today. Forced assimilation, is not something anybody should support. But what I'm talking about here is the question of who is seen as assimilable, who can enter into a new culture and become part of it and assimilate to it and learn its different ways of existing, and who is just too different to be able to do that. So that's the question of assimilability, and that can be a kind of sign for us to see when there's a kind of essentializing, deterministic racism operating, when there is this discussion about some groups and some cultures not being assimilable. So the critique of culture, rather than the biological claims of racism, appears to be more rational. It has this cover of rationality to it, because you have universal standards that are applied to everybody. That's rational. But these universal standards are unilaterally decreed in most cases. Fanon talks about this, Santiago Castro Gomez, I'll talk about in a minute, talks about this, De Souza Santos, and so many others. So in other words, the universal standards aren't really produced in an equally powerful coming together of different views that then produce what the universal standards should be. They're unilateral. And because some cultures are ahead and some cultures are behind, those who are ahead do not need to consult those who are behind, right? What's the point of consulting those who are behind? They're not going to give you reasoned arguments in defense of different ways of existing. So sometimes local people who contest extractivist projects or contest austerity measures in financial markets that are being imposed on them make arguments about, you know, this doesn't go with our values, and they're just seen as economically inept, not understanding market economies, not understanding the nature of capitalism. But it's this binary here that I want to make sure you go away tonight understanding this, because this is the binary concept that is still very prevalent in elite public cultures in our country as well as others. It comes from this Romanian philosopher of religion, Mircea Eliade's influential work in the mid-20th century, particularly from 1961. And he makes this distinction between traditional cultures and historical cultures. So traditional cultures characterize eternity as cyclical, and they engage in rituals of repetition of sacred or mythical events, right? So they see whatever stage they're in as that it will repeat. I mean, it's like the second coming. We have elements of that in the Christian tradition, obviously, but that's what Eliade thinks, is that traditional cultures see eternity as cyclical, and he thinks that they have a value, because what traditional cultures do, as he says, is it gives intrinsic meaning to life. So you know who you are, where you are in the universe, where you are in social relations, what is going to happen. So you have this sense of meaningfulness in your life, which all human beings want. Historical cultures, he defines as seeing themselves as moving through an open or profane space without intrinsic meaning. So if you imagine like the line of historical progress going from back here and advancing ever upward, it's one road, right, that we're all on, and some of us are ahead and some of us are behind. But this road is imagined to be open or profane. It's not, it doesn't carry meaning inside of it, right? It is not directing the movement. So you're in this free space in which you can develop your ideas, your technologies, your economies, your societies, your institutions in an open way. And this makes a lot of sense to see historical cultures are as superior to traditional cultures, because reason requires open-endedness, right? We need to be able to think outside the box. We need to be able to think in innovative ways. So Eliade says historical cultures have this sense of themselves as moving through space without intrinsic meaning, and this allows for innovation and freedom. They are open to change. So this is why advanced societies are seen as advanced, because they are open to change, whereas traditional societies are not open to change. Now, one quick counter I had to throw up here. I mean, one way in which you can counter this way of thinking is to notice the ways in which our own society, which thinks of itself as a historical culture in Eliade's sense, actually looks to be a little bit more like a traditional society, because we see ourselves as the best of all possible worlds, as closed to change as the end of history. The way we do things is determined by human nature, rather than some value system that is arbitrary, right? So there's a deterministic element to market societies, and that's why they're closed to change, they're closed to socialism, they're closed to communism, they're closed to anything else that poses an alternative to current market societies. You can tweak, you can make some adjustments, but our basic form of society is not put forward as a transitional period to a more just society. It's put forward as the only society that works with the nature of human beings. And one other way in which traditional societies get put in the background is with this concept of oral cultures versus written cultures. I'm sure some of you in the social sciences or literature are aware of this. This is a big issue with the discrediting of indigenous societies, which often are oral cultures. And the idea has been that oral cultures engage in repetition, like Eliade's traditional society. They simply repeat sacred texts or poems, like Homer was repeated, or the teachings of Socrates was repeated. Whereas written cultures like our own have more possibility of revision and reform. But this is just not the case. Oral cultures engage in reinterpretations and internal critique, and written cultures sometimes don't. Oral, if you read Leila Ahmed's memoir of growing up in Egypt in a Muslim society in which she participated in her religion in gender seclusion and female-only spaces in which women and girls participated in the oral culture because most couldn't read at the time when Ahmed was growing up. And they reinterpreted the texts. They interpreted it anew. They gave different emphases in the oral repetition, and they debated interpretation. So it's not the case that oral cultures don't have the possibility of any critique. The Homeric poems were read in different ways. There's different versions of them. We're trying to figure out what is the actual version, because oral cultures are constantly mobile and dynamic. So that distinction between oral and written doesn't justify the advanced or backward either. So some lessons from colonial history here. Cultural racism can take different forms, and I want to give some concrete examples. One widespread idea that I think is still with us is that hot and arid climates stymie industry and progress. And I think you have this idea of somebody laying in a hammock under a tree in beautiful weather, and you just reach up for the banana and pull it down. That's all you have to do in these kinds of societies. The indigenous were thought to be able to hunt, fish, and gather the resources they needed without major effort because they lived in areas with such plenty. And hence it was no wonder that their scientific and intellectual achievements lagged behind the colder Northern European cultures. This explanation suggested a correspondence between moral and physical geography, as Santiago Castro Gomez puts it in his recent book, The 0 Point Hubris, which has just come out in English. It provides a kind of normative ordering, not just of bodies or body types, but spatial terrains and environments that were also ordered. The principal problem with geographical or environmental explanations was the inadequate reasoning used to claim causation, as well as intellectual inferiority, or the absence of empirical sciences. To provide sufficient resources for communities, practices of hunting, fishing, and gathering require an inordinate amount of knowledge, including the knowledge of sustainable practices so that sources would not run dry. Such societies often require mobility, and so the sophisticated practices of oceanic navigation developed by the Micronesian groups informed and advanced the capacities of Western explorers. Hunting and gathering communities needed to develop knowledge about how to maintain their environments, leaving a river free to be replenished while moving on to another water source. The necessity of mobility also spurred the development of political knowledge in order to manage group relationships. To be a regularized practice, mobility cannot engender war or conflict every time the community needs to shift its domain, and this requires reflection on cooperation. And the philosopher Kyle White, who's not too far from here at Michigan State, has written extensively on this. Furthermore, lush tropical climates, such as ones that I'm from, are not simply bounties of food resources that discourage industry, but dangerous environments that present numerous problems of pest control. And this requires empirical observation and reasoning, as well as the development of strategies such as inoculation. Here's one example. The people of the Chocó region in Colombia observed in the 1700s that predatory birds such as falcons could safely feast on venomous snakes, but that the falcons typically ate a certain vine before beginning their pursuit. Based on this observation, they developed methods of inoculation by use of what they called falcon's vine, so that they too could operate in areas where such serpents were likely to be found. And there was a Spaniard in the region, Pedro Fermín de Vargas, who tested their vaccine on himself in the late 1700s and confirmed its reliability. Fermín de Vargas, for example, says the credit for the falcon's vine vaccine, though, quote, does not go to the people who prepared the antidote, but to the falcons, unquote. He wrote this up in a report to the monarchs of Spain. Despite their observation, experimentation, and testing, the people of Chocó were viewed as analogous to the animals thought to happen upon a technique of inoculation. And I think both judgments of both the falcons and the people of Chocó, we would say today, was probably erroneous. So, these are just some examples. Other language I want to talk about a little bit are some more recent comparative judgments that build on prior conceptions. The infamous Ben Shapiro argues that the West's supremacy in the world today in terms of material resources is due to its reason and moral purpose, which seems like those would be legitimate reasons, right, if this were true. Putin talks in terms of integrity these days. He thinks that the distinctiveness of a society is based on what he calls its inner energy. So what he's claiming is that Ukraine doesn't have sufficient inner energy to justify itself as a sovereign nation. Sovereignty is not determined by whether or not a country has a self-standing government for Putin. Rather, sovereignty is only real and justifiable when a culture has this inner energy. What is this inner energy? It's often based on homogeneity, and Orban and Hungary makes the same argument. So they're all, really interestingly, all of these neo-fascists today are using culturalist arguments to make their claims of in favor of war or annexation. I think we need to be careful about how we respond to Orban, Trump, Shapiro, etc., and Putin. One strategy that people take in the world of philosophy that I disagree with is to try to develop what I'm calling here decultured responses that imagine political communities that deserve sovereign rights as minimally bound by volitional, institutional, and legal commitments. So in other words, what makes us a polity that deserves sovereignty is that we have all given our consent to, the social contract in some sense. So it's not about our practices, our beliefs, our culture. It's about the volitional nature of our consent to political formations. I think this is descriptively inadequate because who of us has been in the Garden of Eden ready to make consent about the nature of society we're in? It's like the old myth of the social contract theory. So I think it's descriptively inadequate to think that everybody in the society in the West has made institutional and legal commitments in a volitional way in which there were alternatives readily available. So it's descriptively inadequate. And it's descriptively inadequate of the forms in our own cultures. A good example of this is the topic of secularism, which is often seen as on the side of more advanced rather than backward societies. All societies, some think, must become secular. But it turns out, as many theorists of religion and anthropologists and sociologists have been showing for a number of decades now, secularism comes in different forms. There's not one form of secularism. The secularism in our society has a particular Protestant element to it. It's like the individual's relationship of conscience to its own God. That is not the only form of secularism. Today in Iran, believe it or not, despite the mayhem there are theorists and revolutionaries who are articulating a different form of Islamic secularism that has wide support. So we have to stop thinking about decultured approaches to political formations. And I also argue here, I think this is a form of avoidance, right? So to retreat from the debates over cultural practices is a way of avoiding debates over issues of forms of life, ways of existing, and the need to counter fascist worldviews. So I think this is basically a kind of liberal response that's inadequate. So this concept of culture, I won't have too much to say here because I don't want to run too much out of time, but there are debates over the concept of culture on both the left and the right that I want to be very sensitive to. So the dangers of culture on the left are argued to be by people like Paul Gilroy and Christina Beltran, conformity, a kind of coercive conformity within the group. Everybody has to think alike. And there's also a worry that Amilcar Cabral articulated of there being a kind of conflation with nationality. That if we take culture as the same thing as nationality, then we don't allow for multiple cultural expressions or ways of existing to share the same national location. So I think the way to go here is with a general approach that Raymond Williams took, which is an alternative formulation of cultures, in which he calls cultures realized signifying systems. And Raymond Williams was a Marxist sociologist of Britain who died just a few years ago. He wanted to think about cultures as organized systems of practices, meanings, and values. So it's not just a hodgepodge, there's a certain patterns. He wants to say they're essentially involved in all forms of social activity, not just in the arts or education or those kinds of domains of society that are typically associated with culture. He wants to see them in the economy, etc. But he wants to see them also as irreducible to the economy or control of the state. That's the point of talking about cultures, is we're talking about a larger domain, and a domain that actually informs our economic practices and has an impact on our economic practices. So Williams says culture is a noun of process. And I think his approach is compatible with other concepts that I use in my analysis, the colonial matrix of power from Anibal Quijano, the concept of the apparatus and dispositif as developed by Castro Gomez using Michel Foucault's work and so forth. So this is the basic way in which I'm going to define culture here. Now let me give you my counterpoint to cultural racism. Through the work of a Cuban anthropologist who was writing in the first half of the 20th century and wrote this very influential book called Cuban Counterpoint. Fernando Ortiz himself, his earliest work manifested aspects of a colonial mentality and racism. In 1906, for example, he published a book that characterized Afro-Cuban religions as forms of sorcery that were culturally backward. And he saw Cuban culture in general as inferior to more evolved societies. And this was a common view at the time. There was another very famous writer, Uruguayan essayist, Jose Enrique Rodó, who also argued that the solution to Latin America's cultural problems was to imbibe European intellectual culture. These views were not surprising in the early 20th century. Ortiz had his academic training in Spain. As Fernando Coronil argues, the ferment of new anthropological and social theory during the first few decades of the 20th century convinced Ortiz to change his views. And one of his main influences was the historian Ramiro Guerra y Sanchez, who gave a markedly different account of the root causes of corruption and political authoritarianism in Cuba. Guerra located the source of the problem not in Cuba's non-European practices, but it's in its insertion in a global sugar industry, with its plantation economies, history of slavery, need for unskilled labor, and a seasonal workforce. So the problem was not Cuba's culture, but Cuba's dependent economy. Let me go back a second. That kept the population uneducated and desperate. And there were a number of social theorists that began to replace the idea of culture as a singular universal, that had been the argument put forward by Matthew Arnold in the 1800s, who thought there was this one culture, and some countries had more of it and some countries had less of it, but there was just only one culture. And people like Franz Boas started to articulate the idea that there's multiple cultures in the early 20th century. But Ortiz was actually more influenced by the work of Oswald Spengler, whose writings were translated into Spanish and read by a number of Latin American intellectuals. And Spengler helped to push back against the idea that European practices could be taken as universal, and he made it possible to analyze specific cultural forms, such as Afro-Cuban music, without comparing them to European forms. So these new theories of plural cultures began to give rise to a new decentered global imaginary. So it's in this book, in Cuban Counterpoint, published in 1947, which is a treatise on the competing cultures of tobacco and sugar, that Ortiz invents this new concept of transculturation that I want to make use of here. So where acculturation and assimilation works in a unidirectional process, the idea is that I take on the culture of another, and the idea is the person learns something new, I adopt a new culture, I replace my prior culture with this new culture. That's the way acculturation and assimilation works. Ortiz proposed this concept of transculturation as a different process altogether. It is the creation of something new. There is a loss. So there is something of a loss of my prior ways of existing, but I am also involved in creative agency, individually and collective creative agency, to produce a new culture in an encounter. This is Ortiz's idea. And this is not a replacement theory, right? So creative adaptation that involves both collective and individual agency doesn't replace my culture with another culture, because it's a transformation in which I have agency. It's a transformation rather than a simple replacement. And I find it very interesting that Ortiz develops his concept based not on aesthetic expression or religious practice or other domains that are associated generally with culture, but through an analysis of colonial agriculture and the counterpoint between the delicate care needed of tobacco production versus the care of sugar production. He says, tobacco, this is a long quote, he says, tobacco requires delicate care. Sugar can look after itself. The one requires continual attention. The other involves seasonal work. Intensive versus extensive cultivation, steady work on the part of the few, intermittent jobs for many. The immigration of whites on the one hand, the slave trade on the other. Liberty and slavery, skilled and unskilled labor, hands, the hands needed to work the tobacco versus arms needed to work the sugar. Men versus machines, delicacy versus brute force. The cultivation of tobacco brought about the small holding. That of sugar brought about the great land grants. The native against the foreigner, national sovereignty against colonial status, the proud cigar band as against the lowly sack. So this is an interesting analysis, I think, because he shows us how cultural forms emerge out of economic processes. And this is a different way than I think much of the literature on multiculturalism that developed here and elsewhere in the 1990s focused. So the conclusion then I want to make is that this concept of transculturation, I think, performs an important correction to the mythical ways in which the expansion and development and dominance of the West emerged. It helps us to undermine the narrative of Western supremacy that reproduces cultural racism still today in every generation since the conquest, because it offers a reassessment of the past. The emergence of Western science, of industry, of political institutions, and culture in general took the form of transculturation. The Micronesian navigators who informed navigational practices of Western explorers. The empirical scientists of the Chocó region in Colombia who informed the development of inoculation techniques in Spain. And there's just a million other examples that these wonderful young historians who give me hope are telling us about the development of sciences and industries in the West and how they were the product of multiple influences and multiple forces and gave us what we have today. So we really have to redefine all these geographical and cultural categories. When we talk about Western science, if we're going to use that term, we have to reform what we mean by it to understand who we are, where we came from, where our intellectual and cultural traditions emerged from, who had a hand in that and who did not have a hand in it, and who was not credited for it. And I don't think it's always characterizable by theft and appropriation. There's a lot of theft and appropriation that goes on in this period, but there was also something else that Ortiz is trying to get at, which is in his concept of transculturation. So I end with some ideas from Edward Said from his last book on humanism and democratic criticism, one of my favorite of his books, which he's drawing from Vico and trying to develop what I think of as a humanism without empire. So he wants to talk about humanism not as a doctrine, but as a practice. And he wants to say, following Vico, that what unites human groups is their universal capacity to make knowledge, as opposed to absorbing it passively, reactively, dully. Said believed that we can be critical of humanism in the name of humanism. He's writing this very bravely at a time when everybody in my world was trashing humanism left and right, right? On the grounds that Europe used humanism in its colonial efforts in a variety of ways. But Said thinks we can be critical of humanism and yet reform the concept that, schooled in its abuses by the experience of Eurocentrism and empire, one could fashion a different kind of humanism. And I think the humanism he's after is a rejection of ranked types of culture in favor of the view that all human groups engage in meaning making. Thank you very much.
Saw with this lovely talk, I'm sure our speaker would enjoy questions at levels of abstraction, about history, about culture, but also about current events and about the relevance of what you shared with us, what we're trying to make meaning of in our world today. So my colleague has a microphone. Please put your hand up. We're trying to keep a queue, and we'll be walking around.
I'll try to do current events.
Thank you, Dr. Alcoff, for speaking tonight. Do you think the fact that so many people want to migrate to Western countries is not evidence that maybe somehow these cultures are more attractive and work better?
No. It's our colonial history, right? We've sequestered massive material resources here. And we've also been able to produce, in some genuinely positive ways, an intellectual culture of openness, right? In part because of the material wealth. And so who's coming here? Who's coming here are people from formerly colonized areas. In many cases, areas that the United States had a role in colonizing. And they're following the money, right? They're coming to the places where the money is, that in many cases was extracted from their lands and their continents. So you can't understand the pattern of migration today without understanding that colonial history. And it's a complicated and difficult problem because we have ill-gotten gains. Right? We have to face the fact, if we face the fact of history, that we have ill-gotten gains in the global north. And the mayhem, the wars, the devastation, the climate catastrophes, the famines that are besetting many parts of the global south, are in part, I don't want to say totally, but in part caused by these colonial and neo-colonial histories. So there's lots and lots of work on this, on how the West underdeveloped Africa. There's so many books that really try to trace out much better than I can the specifics of the economic history of different regions of the world. So I was born in Panama. I'm half Panamanian. My father's Panamanian. And the United States likes to say, or used to like to say, that it built the canal. Who really built the canal? 10 people died per day building the canal, which took several years. And the canal was a very important venture for transnational capital flows and for the United States in particular. And the United States paid people from the West Indies in silver. They paid people from the United States in gold. And they set up a kind of Jim Crow segregation in the canal zone. So one time when I was, bored and slightly crazy, I decided I would calculate how much money Panama could have gotten if the canal had been in the hands of the country from the first time when it was first operable until it was finally turned over in 1999. And I don't remember the exact number now, but I figured it out. And if you took all of those billions and billions of dollars that the canal made for the United States during that period and had given it to Panama, a lot of the problems that we have in Panama would have a different cast. It wouldn't necessarily be distributed fairly, of course. There are always local challenges, but it would really be a different situation. So that's just one small country. And you have to think about that in relationship to different regions, so Central America in particular. So many of the people trying to cross our southern border are coming from Central America, which the U.S. supported, lots of bombings and lots of wars and lots of covert activity and lots of CIA activity and training of torturers in El Salvador, and on and on. So we're getting payback. What Juan Gonzalez wrote years ago was that migration is the harvest of empire, right? And it's still with us. So that's why I think it's not, their motivation to come here is not because they're from an inferior culture and we have a superior culture. Their motivation to come here is to look for a place in which they might economically survive as individuals or with families. And the reason that this is the place where they might have that chance is because of this long history. And the reason, not only are they getting pulled, they're getting pushed. So we have to look at the sources of the pushing that's going on in there. And I don't want to say all of the sources of the pushing are the US or imperialism by any means, but there are many that are.
You mentioned a lot the work of Frantz Fanon, and I was wondering if you had any other recommendations of different works that were related to this topic that we could look up on our own time.
Yeah, I think Fanon is underread. I mean, everybody reads Black Skin, White Mask, and that's a great book, and it really gives you a phenomenological and psychoanalytic portrait of racism, so you'll probably come across that in some class or another, but read these other texts by the Toward an African Revolution, which is a collection of different essays that he wrote. Obviously, The Wretched of the Earth is also, the Wretched of the Earth, which came out in around 1960 by Fanon, it was kind of like the Red Book. It was like the book that all the anti-colonial activists trying to bring political independence to Africa and Latin America and Asia were reading. So it's a very interesting historical read. It's a big overview. So that's important. But I think in Toward an African Revolution and some of his other essays and speeches, he gives us some very still relevant analyses. And he's, when he's saying a colonial country is a racist country, he's not saying that every individual in a colonial country is guilty of conscious racist intent, right? He's looking more at the structural situation and saying that you can't solve the problem of racism by looking at the psychological conditions there. So he really helps us get on the road of thinking about how to think about structural racism.
Thank you so much for your talk. So my question is, you were very careful to say that cultural forms of racism and biological forms of racism can have all sorts of complicated intertwinements. I was thinking about a kind of homophobia that says something like, it's not you that I have any animosity towards, it's your lifestyle. And there's something about that seems very shallow, or, almost said with a wink, like, I have a hesitance or a reticence to take that very seriously. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about or concerns with how seriously we ought to take the cultural framing of some of the racism, and might it just be kind of a shallower or said with a wink and a nudge, but really aiming at racism that is about the person as a person and not about their culture?
Yeah, I think that that is sometimes the case, but I resist the idea that it's always the case. And I really direct you to Lawrence Bloom's book, which is, does a real good typology. And he really shows like what kinds of cultural racisms veer over into biological racism, because they assume that the culture is the automatic product, the determined product of a particular biological type, right? So that's an obvious way in which the thing that's really doing the work there is the biological racism rather than the cultural racism. But his view is in sync with mine, that sometimes cultural racism can stand on its own, and we need to think about this. We need to think about how it is targeting the lifestyle. And one of the ways you can tell is when we think that some people can assimilate. So the individuals can, if they give up their ways, their various ways of dress and interactions and family formation and so forth, they can be assimilable, they can join the ranks of advanced societies, but they have to leave that stuff behind. So really what we're seeing there is the individual as an outlier, right? So that doesn't do anything to address the ways in which we're judging the cultural practices. And I don't want to say there's no legitimacy to any judgment of cultural practices. I think I want to, and it's hard to make a hard and fast distinction between when it's a racist negative judgment and when it's not a racist negative judgment. But here, let me give you an example of that, which is a little far afield for what you asked.
Okay.
But so when I've given this paper in the past, usually the first question is about genital cutting, right? So that's the quintessential example of the cultural practice that, of course, we should condemn, and of course shows that certain cultures are behind and other cultures are ahead. And you can understand the intuitive plausibility of that, because it's a practice that many of us want to reject and want to critique. But here's the problem. So in the 1990s, Alice Walker made a documentary film on the effort against genital cutting, or used to be called genital mutilation at the time, in different parts of Africa. Alice Walker, the wonderful writer who wrote The Color Purple, that was made into a movie, and she's written a lot of other wonderful things. And she made this film about the problem without showcasing any local activists in the countries she was looking at who have been contesting this practice for generations, some with great success. So the only people who she interviewed who appear in the film to offer critical analyses of genital mutilation or genital cutting were Western feminists. So you can watch that film, you can find out a lot about the issue, but you can walk away from it thinking they need outsiders to come in. Whereas the truth of the matter is that I had a colleague at Syracuse University who taught in Africana Studies and who was from Kenya, and her mother led a struggle in their local community against the practice and organized and was an activist and organized the community and won reforms against the practice. And, Chinua Achebe writes a whole book on it, and Simbene writes a film, does a wonderful film on the topic showing the internal debate. And if you tell the story of genital cutting without looking at that internal struggle, it reinforces all the stuff that I'm talking about. So that's why we really have to get at these cultural issues, as hard and complex as they are. and undermine the ways in which they're generally portrayed and analyzed and treated in order to be able to move away from, the ranking of societies.
Thank you.
Tribalism. How do you compare your racism and tribalism? Aren't we all belong to several tribes? Okay, my family, my neighborhood, my state, my whiteness, or whatever. We're all tribal. So how do you compare?
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. Tribalism is defined in different ways, but there's this psychological data that showed in the 1940s that you could divert people's tribal loyalties with very easy sort of tricks by taking kids in a summer camp, dividing them in two, giving them different names, supporting their vilification of the other side, and they would go to blows, right? So you can whip up this kind of internal loyalty based on really nothing. And it was argued for a long time that that was proof of a kind of deterministic natural tendency of human beings to be loyal to their own group and reject others. That view has now come under criticism because of countervailing kinds of arguments. But the real question is, on what basis do we define our sensibilities in relation to groups, right? Do our political cultures play a role in the ways in which we define ourselves as Americans first, or people of the Western Hemisphere? We make connections across. I think it's so odd that in the United States there's very little sensibility of a connectedness in this hemisphere, as if we're just Europe reborn. Because the history of this hemisphere, I'm talking about from Canada down to Chile, is very much shared. It's the conquest, it's slavery, it's annexation and genocide of indigenous lands, it's European conquest. There's a lot of similarities across this whole Western divide, but there is a blockage to seeing our troubles in the United States as similar to troubles in other parts of this hemisphere. And I think that's because of a certain political culture and discourse that has separated the United States as if it was a reimplanted England in the middle of the Atlantic and the Pacific. So I do think that the critique of cosmopolitanism is correct insofar as the argument is that we have particular connections, material connections and material relationships that guide our moral attachments. I don't think that's necessarily evil or wrong. I think it comes out of human experience and of being embodied beings. But it's all about how we define who we are connected to and who we are in relationship with. And that's one thing that I like about the concept of transculturation. Because transculturation, which is a fact, it's a nice concept, but it also represents, I think, a more historically accurate fact of the way we got to be the way we are, means that we are in relationship with people in this hemisphere. We are in relationship with people outside of our own racialized group, right? We are influenced by them. Country music. So country music is a contested terrain. Like, some people hate Elvis, but Elvis did have, talent. But the issue is that, of course, the idea that country music is white is just a historical mistake. The banjo came from Africa. Not only that, but the way of plucking instead of strumming also came from Africa. So quintessential elements that are at the center of what we take to be, a very indigenous U.S. cultural musical form are actually African. And some of that is going to be understood as theft and appropriation, not giving credit where credit is due, and some of it is real transculturation. It's a formation of something new from the encounter of different cultures in proximity with each other that was new and creative and wonderful, and a lot of people enjoy today. So what does that mean for tribalism, right? How do we have to think about who am I connected to if I like country music?
Don't we absorb all of that? Isn't it all part of who we are? I mean, that's what America is, okay? A little of this, a little of that. That's a good thing.
I agree.
So I have an abstract question, since you said we could ask those.
Did I?
So in your explanation of racism, you favor structural explanations over agential ones, where agential ones, so structural causes are ones that operate in a way that's independent of the intentions of individual subjects within who live within the structure. But at the same time, it's one of the constant themes, both of this talk, but also from the Future of Whiteness, that you reject determinism and deterministic elements in your thinking. And I'm just asking how you sort of reconcile those. What are you thinking about when you're sort of resisting the deterministic, and how does that square with your structural explanations?
Yeah, we need middle term concepts like choice structure, which we talked about some this afternoon in your class, and ways in which individuals I think individuals are responsible for their behavior, right? So I don't want to let individuals off the hook for their behavior. But individuals operate within a structure of choices and also a structure of meaning, right? That they can and do contest and modify and change, and we're constantly doing that, both on an individual level and a collective level. But there's also choice structures that we have to make, choices within a set limit of possible options in order to survive, for example. So there's both collective processes that affect us and individual choices that we make. And I don't want to let individuals off the hook of taking responsibility for their decisions or of having agency. But we need to think more than we do about the structural conditions. It's hard to do. I mean, like policing, right? I heard some wonderful coverage today of some recent wins that were made on the effort of holding police communities to account. But the issue is that on the one hand, we want to know which policeman did what, and we want to hold them accountable. But we can't stop with that, because we have to look at, and that's what was so good about this report. It was talked about on today's Democracy Now! Show, which everybody should watch every day. Not just because my son works for them, but because you'll find out news that you really would not find out anywhere else. But it's the culture of not just policing in general, but particular communities, like in Baltimore or in Ferguson or in Atlanta. There's particular police communities that may connect to larger communities, but that have certain practices and allow certain practices. And so we just can't, and the same as, when I wrote the book on rape, I was looking at this same problem in which a lot of the activism around rape has been focused on courts and improving the situation within the legal system so that cases of rape could go forward with success in terms of prosecutions. But the concern is that you could have successful prosecutions in the courts, and that might have a small deterrence effect, but it's not going to change rape cultures on college campuses or rape cultures in our society at large. So we have to find a way to talk about things that are not just at the individual level. And in fact, I think it's more important to talk about the things that are not just at the individual level if we want to make substantive, significant social change. I don't know if you agree, Mark.
So thank you for the talk. I'm just going to put my metaphysics hat on for a second and hope that's not too annoying. But I was just wondering, it seems like it's very hard to give conditions for what counts as part of a culture or not part of a culture. So if I'm trying to think of something like American culture, there's so much history, there's so many different groups, there are so many different people, that it seems like the only thing that it's really nailed to is a nation. So then you have a nation and you can talk about the culture of it, but what really belongs to or doesn't belong to American culture. Or I was trying to think of something like the culture of soccer fans. But of course, really there are soccer fans, I know that. But there's so many various cultures in various places that it's not clear that there's one thing. So my skeptical worry is that the notion is a little too fuzzy and ambiguous to do sort of cause and effect kind of analytical work. That's the concern. I'm just voicing that concern and would be interested in what you have to say about it.
Yeah, that's a big debate going on, and in much of the social sciences, you don't even use the word culture anymore because of the worry. And it's not because they're philosophers, because philosophers, we want clarity and distinctness between these categories, and you're not going to get clarity and distinctness in categories like culture, but because there's a worry about if you provide, really distinct characterizations of a culture, you're going to veer into essentialism and over-homogenization, and you're going to miss the complexity and the nuance and the interconnections between different practices. So it's a treacherous field for a philosopher to walk into. But I think, what I draw from is our common sense language, right? So I think in common public discourse, we talk about cultural practices and we talk about different cultures. And I think we can draw some general ideas about how the concept of culture operates, even without clear and distinct boundaries between them. And you find this a lot of times. A lot of people from the United States say they think, the United States doesn't really have a culture, and then they go to another country and they realize that actually the way they are in the world is quite different from the way people are where they are, in the new place. So they become reflective and observant of their own dispositions and proclivities in a way that they weren't before. We're informal, right? We go around in shorts, right? These various kinds of elements, which isn't true of all of us in this country, but there's certain elements like that. So I think that we need to talk about this, and I think there's a validity to talk about this because it is part of our public speech. And I tend to always disagree with those philosophers of language who think that, if it's a wrong concept, it doesn't matter if it's being used widely in public speech. That was the debate for 20 years about race, right? That race just means biological heredity, and people should stop using it because that has no meaning, has no referent in the real world. And they were missing the ways in which people actually use it on the ground. The ways in which people use the concept of race on the ground is incredibly complicated. They will recognize that race is not nationality, but sometimes they'll flip in and talk about it, in they'll recognize that people have race, but they don't take it as absolutely determinative. So notice how people use these different categories around you. And I think there's a certain sophistication and recognition of dynamism. In the Latino community, this is widely known, that people will present themselves with different terms in different contexts, and people have changed our understanding of how we define ourselves. Gerald Torres used to always tell this story about how in the small town he grew up in the southwest of the United States, if you were really, really poor, people would call you a Mexican. If you had a little bit more money, they might call you a Mexican American. If you really had money and illusions about yourself, you could call yourself a Spanish person. If you'd gone away to college and come back, you'd call yourself a Chicano. And if you really had achieved solid middle class, you'd call yourself Italian. And what's funny about this is everything but the last one is okay, right? Everything but the last one does have some connection to the real. But when people are, whose entire lineage comes from Mexico are calling themselves Italian, they're doing something different. So it's not that we can't critique common speech, but we can notice how it recognizes flexibility and dynamism, and most people recognize that they have ethnicity and racial identities, also national identities, and also sometimes those things don't matter and they're just individuals. And so I think we can draw from speech about cultural practices to see the ways in which it animates our judgments of ourselves and of others and of other cultures, and see the kind of work that it's doing and try to intervene in some of that.
Thank you very much for your talk, Linda. I wanted to ask one last question, if that's okay. So I was curious about the way that you linked the concept of cultural racism to developmentalist thinking, or at least a certain kind of way of looking at history in a developmentalist sort of sense. Like, I like the arm image, right? Where, certain cultures are further along the arm and some are further back. But I'm wondering what lessons we should take from your talk about developmentalist thinking as such. Like, is it that that's a baby that we ought to throw out with the bathwater of cultural racism? Or are there like other non-culturally racist modes of developmentalist thinking that are worth holding on to? So like, for example, I'm thinking of Amilcar Cabral, who you were talking about, and he was certainly open to criticizing indigenous Guinea-Bissauan cultures on the grounds that they weren't like sufficiently, that they had like regressive or reactionary elements that weren't in line with the liberation of that particular colony, Portuguese colony. And he was very much like embraced, and so did Walter Rodney, like a kind of developmentalist thinking that saw some kind of socialist or communist society as being like more advanced in some ways, or as capable of advancing the human race as such, whereas capitalism was, inherently regressive in some ways. So do we need to get rid of that kind of developmentalist thinking as well? Or is there some other kind of developmentalist thinking that would be like non-culturally racist that we should embrace? If so, like, is there a humanistic developmentalist thinking? I don't know. I'm just babbling here, but I wonder what you might do with that. Yeah.
No, it's a totally legitimate question. I mean, I do think that those mid-20th century anti-colonial writings of Cabral and Fanon and Nkrumah and Lumumba and others, we kind of dismissed all those as insufficiently anti-humanist at a certain point. Post-colonial thinking, and some continental philosophy kind of dismissed all those writings as too modernist because of this developmentalist language, and not sufficiently theoretically sophisticated on a number of ways. And I and a number of other people are trying to resuscitate that tradition and encourage people to read it. One great book is by Adam Getachew, who Ways of World Making, and she's doing an analysis of this mid-20th century set of texts and writings, and arguing that they had way larger visions than they have been credited for. They weren't simply aiming for national independence and governments. They were really aiming for socialism, for regional economic cooperation, for much broader aims. But that's all to say that doesn't mean I agree with everything they said. There's a lot of, there's some gender stuff left out. There's some sexual stuff left out of those readings, to put it mildly. And the developmentalism, I think, actually we have to let go of. So we should continue to mine those texts for lots of things we still have to learn, but not that. So I think the problem with developmental, it's very naturalistic, right? So there's a human nature that is unfolding. It's very Hegelian, depending on how you read Hegel. But there's a human nature that's unfolding. So there's, and that's vulnerable to a determinism, right? When we start making those kinds of arguments. And it's really hard to think about developmentalism that won't engage in ranking. And we have to get away from ranking. So what that means is that doesn't mean no criticism, but it does mean that whole cultures can't be put in the ahead or behind categories. So I think we have to get our head around the possibility that there's plural forms of flourishing. One of the best books on this is my colleague Serene Cotter's book, Decolonizing Universalism. Everybody should study that, and feminist, because she's really trying to think about transnational feminism and take seriously the critique of sexism and make that a universal, but allow the critique of sexism to give rise to multiple forms of flourishing. So in some societies, there's gender divisions of labor. You do one kind of thing with a female body and another kind of thing with a male body. And then there's oftentimes other kinds of options. But there's certainly a gender association between the kinds of activities that you do. And that kind of society might not be one that we want to live in, that I want to live in. But it is a society in which there is flourishing, there's community, there's protection against violence, there's connection and there's support. And so I can understand the attractions of that community and not see it as a lesser form of liberation than the one I imagine for myself or my grandchild, my granddaughter, but as a genuine form of liberatory life and flourishing life that could be alongside and different from my own. So I think we have to, and this is a hard project, and we're just starting, is to think about plural forms of liberation, plural notions of freedom, plural notions of justice, plural notions of gender expression and family formation. That doesn't mean that everything gets lauded, but it does mean that we stop thinking that there's one vision of the liberatory future that we'll all be measured against. And, it usually turns out to be Western.
Oh, we're actually all out of time for tonight, but please join me in thanking our speaker. And if folks want to stick around and talk more, we can. Thank you, Linda.